All right, let's dive in. We're constantly being told how things are supposed to work, right? We hear it in official policies, economic forecasts, the daily news headlines. But what happens when you look at the actual data, the real-world results, and it tells a completely different story? That gap, that growing chasm between the stated intention and the complex reality, that's what we're exploring today. It's all about divergence.
So here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll look at a fractured economy that seems to be telling two completely different stories at the same time. Then, we'll see how that same pattern creates these, well, paradoxical results in public policy. We'll even get into the psychology of why these contradictions are so darn hard for our brains to process. And finally, we'll put all the pieces together to help you make sense of this noisy, fractured reality.
Okay, let's start with the economy. This is where these divergences really hit home for all of us, right? It affects our jobs, what we pay at the store, and the businesses right in our own communities.
Now this isn't just some abstract number on a chart. We're talking about Value City Furniture, a company that's been around for 75 years, suddenly filing for bankruptcy. A real-world event like this is the perfect starting point for our investigation. I mean, what causes a household name to just vanish?
And here is the divergence in a nutshell. On one side, you've got a policy with a very clear stated goal: protect American businesses. But then you look at the reported outcome. A huge American company with over 1,000 employees goes out of business, and they point directly to that policy as a major reason why. That is a profound disconnect.
And look, this wasn't just a one-off thing. The data shows just how much tariffs drove up costs across a whole range of things we buy every day. I mean, check this out. Christmas decorations, toys, even stuff for your pets. They saw these massive jumps in tariff rates. And these aren't small adjustments. We're talking about significant new costs that just ripple through the entire supply chain. And guess who they hit in the end? Retailers and consumers.
So economists actually have a name for this whole phenomenon. They call it a K-shaped economy. And honestly, it's the perfect visual. Just picture the letter K. After some kind of downturn, one arm of that K shoots straight up. That's the part of the economy that's thriving, doing great. But the other arm, it goes down. That represents the sectors and the people who are getting left behind or even falling further. You've got two completely opposite realities happening at the exact same time.
And this isn't just some theory. You can see it right in the Federal Reserve's own data. Their Beige book publication lays out these two diverging paths pretty clearly. On one side, they note continued strength among the wealthy. But on the other side, they're reporting things like businesses having trouble collecting payments, a jump in demand for food assistance, and food banks running low. Both of these things are true at the same time.
You know, sometimes a single sentence can capture this divergence better than any chart ever could. This quote, it just puts a human face on all this data. You've got highly educated young people with degrees in fields that are supposed to be in high demand, and they're underemployed. It's just a brutal disconnect between the skills people are building and the jobs that are actually out there.
So let's shift gears. This pattern of divergence, of outcomes just completely defying intentions, it isn't just limited to the economy. It actually runs deep into the world of public policy, and it creates what you could call a policy paradox.
Okay, take this example. The U.S. starts carrying out strikes on suspected drug boats in the Caribbean. Now, the stated goal here is crystal clear, and you can't really argue with it: disrupt trafficking and fight an epidemic that's costing about 100,000 American lives a year. A very straightforward, very important objective.
So, what was the immediate result? What did the data show? A massive surge in the price of cocaine. We're talking a 30 to 45% jump per kilogram. The very action designed to disrupt the supply chain had a direct and maybe even predictable effect on the market price.
And this quote just explains the paradox perfectly. By making the product harder to get and jacking up the price, the policy may have accidentally made drug trafficking even more profitable. Yeah, the risk is higher, but the reward is way higher, which creates this powerful new incentive for people to get into the trade.
Now let's look at a totally different kind of policy divergence, this time from inside the Department of Justice. The stated mission of the DOJ is simple: enforce the law, ensure public safety. But according to dozens of attorneys, the environment inside the department was actually undermining that exact mission. Reports of national security units being hollowed out, with over 100 years of legal experience just walking out the door.
This quote from a DOJ insider is just staggering. It points to the ultimate divergence. It's not just a policy having an unintended outcome, it's a clash between the entire purpose of justice, which is supposed to be about finding facts, and a demand to fit a pre-written narrative. When the goal changes from finding truth to telling a story, the whole institution gets turned on its head.
Okay, so we've seen divergence in the economy. We've seen it in policy. But the big question is, why is this stuff so hard for us to process? Why do we always seem to gravitate towards a simple story when the reality is so incredibly complex? So this next section is all about looking inward, at the psychology behind why we have such a fractured view of the world.
This line from the writer Morgan Housel just nails it. The lens that you and I see the world through is incredibly tiny. It's just our own life experiences. But that microscopic sample size has this huge, outsized influence on how we think the entire world works. Nothing, and I mean nothing, is more persuasive than what we've seen with our own two eyes.
And this creates a fundamental conflict inside all of us. You can think of it kind of like the stock market. In the short term, the market is a voting machine. It's driven by popularity, by emotion, by simple, catchy stories. But in the long run, it's a weighing machine, where the boring stuff, the fundamentals, and complex data eventually win out. We're always caught between these two forces, the easy, compelling story versus the complicated, often counterintuitive data.
And this slide really exposes how flawed our perception of risk is. Some academics built these indexes to measure economic uncertainty, and they found something pretty startling. The moments when we felt the most certain about the future, when these uncertainty indexes were at their absolute lowest, were immediately before the biggest shocks of our lifetime: 9/11, the 2008 financial crisis, and the COVID pandemic. It turns out our feeling of certainty is often a terrible guide for what's coming next.
So, how does this all fit together? Well, our brains are basically wired with these shortcuts, these biases. We tend to look back at the past with nostalgia, right? We forget how anxious we were, because we know how the story ended. At the same time, we view the present through this lens of negativity, because we're just bombarded with bad news 24/7. And we build our entire model for the future on the simplest foundation there is, our own limited experience, and the simple idea that tomorrow will probably be a lot like yesterday. So, where does all of this leave us? We've got a fractured economy, paradoxical policies, and brains that are hardwired to look for the simple story. In this final section, let's try to pull all these pieces together and figure out a coherent way to navigate this moment.
The logic of this whole explainer really boils down to these 4 steps. First, it starts with seeing the real-world divergence in the economy, like that K-shaped recovery. That leads us to spot the same pattern in these policy paradoxes. Then we have to realize that this is so hard to accept because of our brain's preference for simple narratives. And here's the kicker. All these forces combine to create the fractured reality we live in, where what we feel is true and what the data says is true can be 2 completely different things.
And that brings us to the central idea here. If you take one thing away from this, let it be this. Maybe the most important trend right now isn't some single line going up or down. Maybe the trend is the divergence itself, the fact that multiple, contradictory realities are all happening at once. Just understanding that, that's the key.
And that leaves us with one final, pretty challenging question to think about. In a world where a simple, emotional story can feel more real than a mountain of complex data, how do we make decisions? How do we decide what's actually real?
And as always, just a reminder that this analysis is purely for educational purposes. The data we've talked about is a snapshot in time, and you know how quickly things change. So please, make sure you do your own due diligence, stay disciplined, and stay sharp.